So as you may have seen with some of my previous videos, I'm doing a series going over some of the big content and system changes I would like to see in the future of Diablo 4. In my first video, I went over the changes I would like to see to the unique items in the game. In my second video, I went over what I would like to see with the tempering system going forward. And in this video, I want to go over legendary aspects because I think this system is in a much more boring spot than it was previously, and I think there are some pretty massive changes and new additions we could see with the system to make it significantly more interesting. Now I think first we have to go back and look at legendary aspects before Lord of Hatred, because that's really where this system got a pretty massive change. Previous to Lord of Hatred, legendary aspects were the main way in which you changed the play style of the abilities or build you were going for. A lot of the gameplay impacting effects was from the legendary aspect system. But when we went into Lord of Hatred with the skill tree overhaul, they removed the vast majority of legendary aspects that changed your gameplay in some way. The main idea behind this is that they would take most of the gameplay changing stuff, put it in the skill tree, and legendary aspects would pretty much only be for power increases. It wasn't for gameplay impacting things anymore. But I think they went way too far with this, because if you look at legendary aspects right now, they're almost all just like pure stat increases. They're pretty much all different versions of affixes you would find on gear. Like, go look at all the legendary aspects you have on your pieces of gear on the build or character you're playing right now. They're all pretty basic. Like, if I go look at one of my druid builds, it'd be a damage increase while fortified. It would be a damage increase while I have barrier. It would be like a crit damage increase while I'm in werebear. It would be like a damage reduction from having resolve stacks. All of that is very, very basic stat increases. And while I think that's going to be the main focus of legendary aspects going forward, again, I think they went way too far with this, and I think they could still have legendary aspects that have gameplay impacting stuff. It just doesn't need to be as widespread as it previously was, but I think the system is just way too boring right now. I think they do need to add back in some of the gameplay impacting stuff and have legendary aspects be more important for gameplay changing stuff than it is right now. And I do think they can also reduce the actual just damage or power increases you get from legendary aspects while doing this as well. And I think one of the biggest reasons they need to add some of the stuff back is because they just removed so much stuff that was not added back into the game with skill trees. Like, for instance, I mainly play a druid. There are legitimately entire builds that no longer exist that were in one point in the game's history very strong, just because their effects just weren't added back into the game with the skill trees. Like, for instance, there used to be a build called Tramp Slide for a druid where there were 3 different legendary aspects that would proc landslides, which is one of our core skills, through other effects. And with these builds, and the reason these builds were so interesting, especially when they were strong in the first couple seasons, is that instead of using landslide, which is a spirit spending casted core skill, you would instead not even have landslide on your bar, and you would be casting landslides through procs from multiple other skills. One of the legendary aspects would cause a circle of landslides to spawn around you when you used one of your companion skills, which was called Poison Creeper. This is very strong for leveling, and when this build was strong, this is one of the main damaging parts of it. Then you had another legendary aspect where when you trampled, which is this big like charge skill in werebear, it would then cause a massive landslide across the entirety of your screen, which you could legitimately fill a whole screen of landslides. The third one was that anytime you casted a landslide, it would do it a second time. So both of those other legendary aspects I just talked about would do that thing twice. So when you casted Poison Creeper, it would do a circle of landslides around you, do it a second time. Then you could also get some of the effects of upgrading your landslide in your skill tree without it being on your bar. So you would mix these 3 things together, and instead you would have a cooldown focused build built around landslide, just you wouldn't be casting landslide. Normal landslide build would be a casted landslide where you need spirit and you need a lot of spirit gen to be able to infinitely spam it. but Tramp Side version would be completely based around cooldowns. Two completely different builds focus around the same skill, utilizing it in completely different ways. Legitimately, none of that is possible anymore. You still have landslide, and there is a strong landslide build. There's no landslides being procced from other skills anymore. And this was also one of the most satisfying builds. So the fact that none of what I just went over exists anymore, even for normal landslide, none of those aspects exist anymore, that is just something that's completely removed from the game. And I think they either need to start adding this stuff back, whether it be expanding the skill tree more for more options, or just adding this stuff back to legendary aspects will just make the game better. Like, just having more choices is better than not having more choices. And even if some of this stuff isn't super strong, just having the ability and choice to do this stuff will just be better. And I think they removed way too much stuff through legendary aspects without adding enough back to the skill trees. So as you may have guessed, the first thing I want with the future of the legendary aspect system is to add in back some of these old things and add in some new things that are gameplay changing in some way. They don't have to be as substantial as they used to be, but adding some of that stuff back in will be a pretty massive increase to the system in general. Now, another thing I think they could do is add in powerful stat increases that we currently don't really have in legendary aspects. Like, one of the big ones is like crit chance. Right now, we have a few things that can increase attack speed, which is one of the things you would want to cap outside of crit chance. But then we just have like damage increases, and crit chance is actually something that for a lot of builds is hard to cap. So having a legendary aspect that could be more focused on crit chance could be more interesting than just another damage increase. It could allow you to change things out in your actual gearing. It could allow you to potentially change some upgrades in your skill tree. So just extending out the power increases we get from legendary aspects to have a wider width of options would also be better than what we have now, which again, for the most part, is just like basic damage increases. Now, on top of these, there is a more outlandish system idea I had for adding in new legendary aspects. Now, this first thing could tie into this new system I'm talking about, or it could just be normal legendary aspects. This is Kiss Curse effects. And while I'm somebody that doesn't like a ton of Kiss Curse effects in RPGs, I think having a few of them could be good. And a Kiss Curse effect is just, it gives you a bigger effect, but gives you a downside. And I think because of how Diablo 4 is designed and with some of the options we have, Kiss Curse could be a really good introduction into some of the systems, just because, say, for like resource management, a lot of builds now, especially with some of the upgrades to some of the uniques, resource management is kind of easy with some of the builds that it shouldn't necessarily be that easy. But if you have like a Kiss Curse effect where it gives a massive damage increase, but let's say increase the resource cost. Let's say for you get increased damage while you have a barrier, maybe there would be a Kiss Curse version of this where you get even more damage while you have barrier, but it costs a lot more resources instead. Now, even though these could be like normal legendary aspects, this ties really heavily into what I'm calling ultimate aspects. Now, my idea for these ultimate aspects is that you could only use one ultimate aspect in total. So you'd essentially just be able to get an ultimate version of an aspect. Maybe just anytime you get a legendary aspect, you could just spend more resources or something to turn it into an ultimate aspect, or maybe ultimate aspects are just a like rare role you could get on legendary gear. So not super certain on how you would acquire these, but an ultimate aspect, as mentioned, would be something you could only use one of, and it would usually be something more unique than what you can normally have. But outside of only being able to use one, these things would be more focused on being on more important aspect slots. So on your weapon, if you're using a two-handed weapon, it's double the power of a normal aspect. On your necklace, it's a 50% increase to the aspect. And then on something like rings, you have more options just because you can get the resource aspects on those, which is the only place you can really get those as well. So the more important slots is where these would be more focused around. Now, I did make up some mock-ups with some possible options that these could be. One of the first things I thought of was, what if on a two-handed weapon, specifically on a two-handed weapon, you could get an ultimate aspect that increases the effect of all other legendary aspects by some amount. This mock-up I have is by 15%. You'll also notice that these mock-ups I made, the aspect is in green, so it indicates it's an ultimate aspect. So you can only have one of these green aspects. This could be really strong, and as mentioned, it'd only be allowed on a two-handed weapon, which is the most important slot. Maybe allow it on one-handed weapons as well, but make it half power. But the mock-up I made is increasing the effect of all other legendary aspects by 15%. So now every other legendary aspect on your character is increased by this percentage. advantage. Whether it's a resource generating aspect or a defensive aspect or a damage increasing aspect, all of it is increased by this 15% or whatever other amount you want. And I think this could be just a really interesting option if you were to add in these ultimate aspects, because this would give you a lot of power. And again, it's on a weapon, so it's already the most important slot, especially if you only kept it to 200 weapons. It gives you a lot of buffs of other things. This may not necessarily give you the highest damage you could possibly get. Just having a normal legendary aspect on your 200 weapon could possibly be better. But what this would do is give you more utility or more resource generation, which isn't just pure damage increase, but it also gives you increases to your defensives, which I think a lot of classes right now, especially with the resolve nerfing going into season 14, or specifically the resolve capping, a lot of builds have a problem getting the defenses. There are even some builds, even focused more on the druid that I play, that kind of have the damage to do much higher pit runs, but you can't really survive, especially if you're a pure melee build, like a basic skill melee build. Some of those builds just don't have the survivability to do the higher tier content, especially if you get into higher pits. Well, something like this would also buff up your defensive aspects, which since they mainly just have like big DR increases, this could be a really big defensive increase. So just buffing up all of the legendary aspects really makes you think much more about every legendary aspect in your build as a whole. So I think this could be a really interesting version of an ultimate aspect you could only have one hub on at any time. Another option would be more of that kiss curse effect I talked about. So this would be essentially a kiss curse effect of the conceded aspect, which normally in game is when you have a barrier, you deal increased damage. Well, this one is you deal a lot more damage where you have barrier, but you gain half the normal amount of barrier. So if you normally gain 10,000 barrier from this thing, you would gain 5,000. But this currently on a 200 weapon, which this would be something you'd be able to put on multiple slots probably, this gives a 200% damage increase on a 200 weapon, but you gain half barrier. As a druid main, we have a lot of barrier because pretty much every druid uses Earthen Bulwark through their rune set. If we only got half barrier from that, your survivability massively goes down. But if you're a tanky enough build that can always have barrier up, which would be harder with the downside of this, you could get a much bigger damage increase than normal. So kiss curse effect. Can your build actually keep barrier up to get this damage bonus? And can you be survivable enough with half barrier to be able to also survive with that? Very interesting, would potentially change up how some builds work, but would also give you a massive upside if you could make the rest of your build revolved around this to make sure it's always up into where you can survive. So good version of a kiss curse ultimate affix. Then another one, which I was a bit more iffy on in how this would work, but this could be something in general, not necessarily the specific one. And this would be something that you would limit to, let's say, a necklace or something. So this one reads, your earth skills are now also storm skills. This would specifically be for a druid where any earth skill you have is also now a storm skill. That means it can enable a bunch of additional effects. It can enable some legendary nodes in our Paragon boards. It could enable some effects through our skill trees. It could enable multiple different effects through our legendary aspects. Like one legendary aspect is your storm skills make enemies vulnerable and deal more damage to vulnerable enemies. Well, now if you're using this as an earth skill, maybe you had a hard time applying vulnerable before with this earth build, but now they're also storm skills. So now you could use that legendary aspect. You have free vulnerable on anything, and that could be a pretty big increase to using this. And like I mentioned, this doesn't necessarily have to be exactly this. The ability to add other tags to a skill is a pretty impactful effect, especially if it's something you normally couldn't do. And that's why an effect like this would be on an ultimate aspect and would have to be on a specific, more important slot. Like this one would specifically be on a necklace. Necklaces have 50% increased aspects normally, so you would have maybe a massive reduction. Like if I put the damage increase while fortified aspect on a necklace, that's I think a 90% increase in multiplicative damage. That's a pretty big downside to using something like this, but this would change up how you customize the rest of your build. And these different examples I made up don't have to necessarily be what the effects would be, but I do think a system like this would add a lot more intrigue and interesting things to the aspect system, especially since these effects are very strong, but you can only have one of them on at a time. This would very much change up how you create your builds, especially since some of these effects could just be that strong because they're so limited. And as I mentioned, this is a much more kind of pie in the sky thing that they could potentially add into the game. But I don't think this is something that is super outlandish when it comes to just adding a new system into the game, especially just adding on top of something we already have. But in my opinion, this would just add a lot more interesting build crafting into the game, just because now you have this other super strong effect that you can only have one of that would potentially be massively reducing your damage, but adding in some other effect here that could completely change up how you create your build. Like if I'm playing a druid right now and I have the ability to add the storm tag to all of my earth skills, there are so many new options I could potentially do. There's so many new uniques that could potentially work with this. There are so many different effects that I can now apply specifically to earth skills now, and this wouldn't necessarily make any earth build for the druid right now like super strong. Like just going through my head and thinking about all the options, there isn't much that stands out as something that would just be like crazy OP with this effect, but there are a bunch of different options that could potentially be fit into an earth build to make it better having this effect. Even though having it on a necklace would again massively reduce your damage because of the damage increase you could potentially be getting just using a normal aspect on here. So I think this ultimate system for legendary aspects would be a really cool introduction into the legendary aspect system to make it just more interesting. And on top of that, everything else I went over in this video, I think they need to add back in more legendary aspects to give more options. I think they need to add back some of the gameplay changing ones and just give a lot more options in general for the aspect system. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.